Kia ora, everyone. We are just waiting for people to arrive. We'll give ourselves another minute or so. As you can see down there, lots of people joining us, so thank you for that. Feel free to say hi in the chat if you want to introduce yourselves. All right, it's 5 past. I think we'll start if you're ready. Fantastic. Kia ora, everyone. We'll start with whakatauki as always. So, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana te atakura, e tihau he huka, e hauhu, tihei Maori ora. So, kia ora koutou, and my name is Andrea. You might remember me from last year's post-budget webinar. Fantastic to see you all here. Over 300 participants already, so that's a fantastic turnout. And I'm very glad that you made time today to listen to our two guest speakers. We have Craig here and Kerry, who I will introduce in a second. And we are going to talk about the budget, obviously, which was announced yesterday. It's that time of year again. And the budget tried to strike a very careful balance this year between the cost of living and creating a resilient economy. And the question that we want to answer today here at the webinar is, what does it actually mean for working people? And what does it mean specifically for public and community services and the people who work in those services? So we want to discuss those questions with Craig and Kerry. And the way we run our webinar today is we are doing brief introductions, and then Craig will provide his analysis for about 15 minutes from the CTU perspective. Then Kerry will complement that analysis with a specific focus on public and community services for about 5 minutes. And then we'll have some questions. I would like to encourage you to use the question and answer function in Zoom down at the bottom, the Q&A function. And please keep your questions short and succinct, and please make it a question as well. That would be fantastic. We are recording the event as always, so you can also share it afterwards with colleagues and with your whānau to watch, and I encourage you to do so. So without further ado, let's get started. We have Craig Renney here today, the CTU economist, and he was an advisor to Finance Minister Grant Robertson in the past. So he knows the budget from the inside out, and he definitely knows his numbers. So we are very grateful that you can join us again today.
Pleased to be here.
Thank you. And on my left, we have Kerry Davies, our National Secretary from the PSA, and Kerry has been involved in the union movement, advocating for workers for a long time here in New Zealand. So thank you for joining us as well. Craig, I think I'll just hand over to you, and I think you have a presentation for us, which I will share, and then we get started.
Kia ora koutou everyone, ko Craig Renney aho. As I said, I'm the economist and director of policy here at the CTU. As ever, we're slightly in the hands of the technological gods, so please stick with us. I will also happily say that I haven't really slept since Wednesday. So this, it's really lovely to be here. And you're very, very lucky people who've managed to actually get into this meeting. This particular broadcast was hugely oversubscribed to get here. And so thank you all for joining us and talking about what is a really important budget. It's an election year budget. Going to make a really big difference to the country and the national conversation as we head into making some really important decisions on October 14th this year. If I could just if you just want to click through a couple of them. So what I'm going to talk to you about is what essentially is the political background and to the budget. What is the context in which it sits? Then there's an economic outlook, and we look at it in terms of what is the Treasury saying about where the economy is heading. There's a fiscal outlook, which is just a fancy way of saying what are we spending money and how much money are we spending overall. And then we're going to look at some of the spending highlights in the budget. And then finally, the important question, what do we as the CTU think of the budget? And what do we think, is missing, what's good, bad, or indifferent? So first of all, I'm legally required to provide a legal disclaimer at this point. One, I haven't had any special insight into the budget beforehand. Two, I am a member of the Cyclone Recovery Task Force, so I have an interest in that space. But three, and importantly, everything that you see here in this document is a forecast. It is not the absolute truth. It is just simply a direction of travel. It is a statement of where the country is heading to if current trends and terms continue. And so we should be careful not to overinterpret the numbers that are in here, and we should be careful not to put too much weight on what's said in here. It's very much a suggestive rather than prescriptive in terms of where the country is heading towards. So if I start with the political background to this, as you'll all be aware, this is the sixth budget for Grant Robertson, and it's his fifth wellbeing budget. So we're now getting into the groove of actually writing wellbeing budgets. And the budget was written in the looming shadow of an election and a challenging domestic economy. And that challenging domestic economy comes from two parts. One of which is a repeated waves of crises that we've had in the country, everything from COVID-19 through to Cyclone Gabrielle to the Auckland flooding events to a range of other challenges. We've had a range of problems in the country which have meant that the government hasn't had the calm waters in which to deliver its legislative programme or its economic programme. It's had to respond over and over again to external events, way out of its control. And the government's also come under sustained attack for its spending decisions to date and for the level of spending. We've seen lots of TV reports about government being out of control and being addicted to spending, and we'll come on to what the data actually really says about that. But that's a lot of the mood music in the background. And a really big part of the mood music, of course, is that inflation worries everyone. Inflation has been very high recently. It reached 7.3%. It started to come back a little bit, but it's still a very high figure by recent historical standards in New Zealand. And the interest rates that are necessary to help control that are continuing to cause pain and will continue to cause pain for a little while. So you're the Minister of Finance. You're being asked to write the last and possibly the most important budget in the second term of office. And you need to spend all the money, but don't cause any inflation, win an election, and make everybody happy. So that's simple, right? That's great. So what is the budgets are all about choices. They're all about the things that you can control and about making choices in the space that you can control. And what dictates that is the economic outlook. And so if we again, thank you.
thank you for letting us know that the slideshow has frozen. We'll try to fix that.
Okay.
But I think you're just
I'll
continuing.
just keep talking. and
Yeah,
then people
thank
can,
you.
and then we can hopefully when the technology catches up, we will catch up. So in terms of the economic outlook, and I'm sorry you can't see this, although it will just be looking at me, so you're probably better off with that screen. In terms of the economic outlook, firstly, the budget forecasts are produced by the Treasury, not by the government. That's really important in New Zealand because it means they're independent. These aren't the numbers that the government wants you to see. These are the numbers that the Treasury wants you to see. They're actually independently produced. So you should have some confidence in the figures there, particularly around the spending and the taxation and the other levels. So that's, first things first, that's the really important thing. Secondly, the economic forecasts that were produced at this budget are much more optimistic than was the position just 6 months ago at Christmas. At Christmas, we were forecasting that GDP and that the economy would fall into recession. And now recession has been avoided in New Zealand. Inflation, according to the Treasury's reports, starts to fall very quickly. There's a very steep curve down from just about now in terms of inflation falling, and inflation's back in the Reserve Bank's target rate by September 2024. So interest rates, we should start to see some relief from inflation, but also really suffering with that now, and interest rates shouldn't remain as high for as long as may otherwise have been feared. Unemployment rises and interest rates rise, but both are forecast to be lower than some forecasters had expected. So unemployment, for example, peaks at 5.3% in 2024, but then starts to fall again after that. There's no unemployment rate here, which we would typically associate with a very large recession or with a very large fall in the economy. And again, and a big part of that, as you can see, the strength of that is that average wages rise faster than inflation in each year. So every year, for those who are lucky enough to be in work in each of the years, inflation, wages will rise faster in real terms. And that's not necessarily true. Again, if we were going to have a very poor economic outlook, we'd start to see wages start to fall behind in real terms. But right now, Treasury is forecasting real terms wage growth and quite significant real term wage growth in each year. Now, on the other side of that, we're also forecasting continued house price falls. So this time last year, the Treasury was forecasting that house prices would fall 2.5%. The Treasury is now forecasting that just this year alone, house prices across New Zealand will fall 13.4%. And then there'll be a further 4% fall next year. So house prices will continue to fall while demand is declining in that area. And that's a function of high interest rates. High interest rates is also a reason why unemployment rises. And you can see the circularity in what's happening in that. On the other side of that, immigration continues to increase. We have currently record immigration into New Zealand. We have immigration levels actually above those found before COVID. And so as a consequence, there's a little bit of a question mark as the extent to which house prices will continue to fall, because if we have lots more people coming into the country, then by definition, we will have more demand on housing and a greater demand for available properties. If I turn to the fiscal outlook for the country, I just want to, before we start getting into the numbers and what's actually happening, I just really want to get one quick assumption that's been playing out in a lot of media and a lot of people's conversations recently. And that is that we're spending more money than we should be, or that structurally, we're collecting more tax than we should be. There's no such thing as the right level of spending in an economy, and there's no such thing as the right level of tax in the economy. It's very context specific. It's about what you actually need to be investing in, and it's about what you need to be investing on. And so we need to get this idea that the numbers that we had, say, 5-6 years ago are the right numbers. Indeed, arguably, part of the big problem that we have in New Zealand is that for too long, we've consistently underinvested in New Zealand. So simply going back to investment levels, which would be consistent with that underinvestment, would be a really big mistake, and we should recognise that right at the start. Secondly, the fiscal position for New Zealand doesn't look like one of a country gripped by a crisis, either economic or natural disaster, or otherwise. Net debt in New Zealand is very low. Net debt is around 20% across the forecast period and remains well below the government's headline target ceiling of 30%. And if we were to compare ourselves to those countries that we often compare ourselves to, be it Australia, the UK, the US, and Europe, those countries would have net debt positions well in excess of where New Zealand is now. And indeed, arguably, again, much of what the problems we have in New Zealand is a function of not being able to have made those investment decisions because we've artificially constrained ourselves to a 20% picture. OBIGAL, which is the operating balance excluding exceptional gains and losses, which is often just called the surplus or the deficit, comes back into surplus in 2026. It's also really important to note that it's an absolutely meaningless statistic. It's just an accounting entity. It's just a means of saying how much money comes in, how much money goes out on one particular form of basis. You can have an OBIGAL deficit and debt continues to fall and a perfectly functioning economy. So yes, people will talk about it, but if you're asked the question about what it is, then actually take it from me as an expert in this area, OBIGAL is actually a pretty meaningless number. Spending, despite the conversations that we have in New Zealand, is actually pretty stable across the forecast period. Spending is around 32% of GDP this year, and it will be 32% of GDP in 2027. Taxation is relatively stable across the forecast period, again, at around 28 to 31% across the forecast period. And all of these things, if you were to draw them on a chart, are essentially straight lines. They're pictures of Pacific calm. And if you go back in time, you'll see that those levels are actually consistent with the levels that took place right at the start of the Bill English and John Key government, right through the Bill English and John Key government. And so there's not much that's actually moving structurally. We're all remaining the same. So there's nothing in the figures that have been provided that portrays a picture of government spending being out of control. In fact, the Treasury believes, according to a measure it calls the fiscal impulse, that across the forecast period, the government is actually reducing demand in the economy, not increasing. It's not putting prices up, it's actually helping to reduce prices. So in terms of the economy, things look better than they did 6 months ago. Sure, there are absolutely challenges with the cost of living. There are absolutely challenges with interest rates, and it's clearly not great that unemployment will rise and then fall, but it's certainly a lot better than it could have been. On the spending side, there's no cause for alarm. If an alien landed from space, they would say these are actually a very vanilla and very straightforward set of government accounts. So where does that leave us? Well, one of the things we can look at is what are the spending headlights in this budget. And just to give you some idea of how tight the budget allowances are, 79% of all of the spending outlined at this budget is just to keep the lights on, just to pay for inflation. Usually, that's around 50%. And so you can see the impact that inflation is having on the ability of the government to spend money. And as part of trying to fill that list I mentioned at the beginning in the political background slide, we've got 4 billion in savings and reprioritization that was found to help pay for this budget, to help pay for the things that are coming in here. So that said, there are still some goodies. It wouldn't be a budget without rabbits from hats and promises made to people. And I'd say to take you through just some of those at a really high level, and more than happy to take questions on them elsewhere. But the big one and the big winner from this budget was childcare. Investments to extend 20 hours ECE to 2-year-olds was the big flagship programme, alongside providing free public transport to under 13s and permanent half-price fares to those under 25. Insulation, providing the Warmer Kiwi Homes programme, provided a further 100,000 new heating and insulation installations. And we took the Farmac co-payment with $5 co-payment, which will help around 3 million New Zealanders every year. These are great examples of the kinds of spending that does what Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize laureate, calls double duty. They reduce the cost of living for people. They put money back into the pockets of those who absolutely need it the most, and we get better outcomes because people pick up their prescriptions because they don't have to pay for them. People don't have to choose between eating or eating. People can get on public transport rather than drive their car to work. All of these things do double duty. They benefit New Zealanders, they benefit the government, and they benefit the exchequer in the long run. So these are some fantastic spending decisions that the government has made. Another example would be the Healthy Schools Lunches programme, which was continued for children in schools until the end of 2024, or the decision to continue the Apprenticeship Boost programme. Providing more funding for that scheme will help enable up to 30,000 apprentices to keep working towards a qualification at a time when we know we're desperately short of skills, and we have a cyclone rebuild programme which we know we need to deliver. We set aside $6 billion for the cyclone recovery programme through what we call the National Resilience Scheme. That is going to be investing over the next 10 years to make sure that we're making our infrastructure more resilient and helping to tackle the $200 billion backlog in investment that we have in New Zealand. It's a start, but that's on top of $71 billion of capital spending announced through this budget and previous budget programs, which will be taking place over the next 5 years. And that's record levels of investment in capital and in infrastructure in New Zealand. And I don't say that to crow about it. We desperately need that investment because we're so far behind. And we've promised to deliver a further 3,000 new public homes by 2025, which will help to start making dent in the backlog for social housing. We're not there yet. There are still 24,500 households on the social housing wait list. So 3,000 households is a good start, but we still need to do lots more in that space. And to help the economy, one of the areas that in the long run, we talked about, the government talked about, was spending money to deliver 3 new research hubs to help move the economy from the volume to value process that it sees as being a big part of its economic agenda and its trade agenda. And that will tackle issues such as climate change, such as pandemic readiness, and it will support the research and the education for a further 260 PhD students. Help pay for all this program, we're going to be closing some tax loopholes for multinationals, and for trust funds. And over the forecast period, that's due to bring in a further $1.2 billion of spending. So that's quite in the context of a government spending $120 billion a year, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but a few $1 billion here and a few $1 billion there, and you're suddenly talking about some quite serious amounts of cash. And there were a number of other non-fiscal measures. So KiwiSaver contributions for those on paid parental leave was an example of that, where the government's again making decisions, which will have that double duty. They will support people in work, people will be able to make better decisions, and the government's books are benefited in the long run. So what do we think? What do we, the CTU, think of this budget? Well, these are the kinds of investments that make sense, and there's a lot to like in the budget. One of the things that governments often do when they're heading towards an election, when there's political turmoil, when there's whether you've had domestic disasters or you've had other challenges, is that they often become very fiscally conservative, and you see governments turning into austerity and saying, let's not do things right now, let's just get through where we are. And I'm really pleased to see that this government has resisted that call and has actually made investments, like we see in ECE, like in public transport, like in Pharmac, that are about reducing essential costs for New Zealanders. You know, these smart dividends, these smart investments pay dividends now and year after year. And there's a picture emerging. There's the start of a plan that could make a difference to New Zealand. But arguably, we're still hiding behind those fiscal indicators we talked about at the very beginning. And those are still stalling us from making the kinds of transformational change that we might want to see as a country. We're still keeping our spending at 30%. We're still keeping our debt at around 20%. We know we need to move the structural levels of taxation and the structural levels of spending to those that we see in the countries that we compare ourselves to the countries that we often want to look like. They will be spending 10, 20% more of GDP on the public realm, and they will be making that difference to those their populations. And that's where we need to move to. And so we need that full plan to deliver the more productive, sustainable, and inclusive economy that we all want to see. Now, what does this mean for the election? We've seen the government's books. It would be nice, if I can be political for a second, for the opposition to produce its books as well. And so we can see, what they plan to spend money on, and they're not being very clear in that space. But what we can see is that the battle lines are becoming clearer. We can choose to become the kind of country where we make more investments to catch up on those decades of underinvestment, to provide the essential public goods and services that we all know that we need, and do so in a way that delivers them in a quality way, where we're actually tackling real problems, getting to the roots of issues, rather than just making people go round and round. Or we can return to a country where people are increasingly left to fend for themselves, where a person's ability to pay rather than need dictates their access to public services. Our economic growth in New Zealand, and the economic growth is forecast by the Treasury in this document, has made New Zealand the best country in the world to be a business. That's not me. That's the World Bank says that New Zealand is the best country in the world to be a business. We're at the start, and we've got a good start of this becoming the best country in the world to be a worker and the best country in the world to be a child. We've got some important decisions in front of us, but this budget helps lay the groundwork for how we get there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and our sincere apologies for the slideshow glitches. Thank you for staying with us, and thank you for not getting distracted by it. So that was fantastic, and we will make sure that we share the slides afterwards with you. So apologies again. Thank you for the great insights that you shared with us. I think there were some real gems in there, and we already have a flurry of questions there. So we'll get to that in a second. But first of all, over to Kerry Davies, who will give us a bit of a perspective from a public sector and community sector perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Tēnā koutou katoa. I just really want to acknowledge Craig's analysis. Thank you so much. It's just such a privilege to be able to sit here and have your expertise and analysis at the access to our members directly. So thank you so much. I just want to start off with a bit of scene setting from my perspective. So just in terms of the comments pre-budget that were made by the Prime Minister Chris Hipkins promising a no-frills budget as part of his policy drive to get back to basics and focus on the things that matter to Kiwis during this cost of living crisis. He also illuminated about and prioritised the focus being on repairing the country after the latest climate events and the need for investment in building a more resilient economy. Hence the budget tagline, support for today, building for tomorrow. Up until now, the government over 5 previous budgets has invested heavily in the public service, rebuilding capacity and capability and responding to the challenges of the pandemic. and delivered on a commitment to pay the living wage as a minimum for the core public sector. The PSA has welcomed all of that following the previous government's restraints on hiring and spending. We have seen investment in the workforce, more than 13,000 additional public sector jobs since 2017, many in response to COVID and to catch up to the increase in our population and demand for services. We can't get away from the reality that we are still rebuilding after the austerity of the previous government, which saw a rundown in the capability of the public service, and in particular health, education and social services. Public service cuts hurt, and it takes generations to repair the resulting damage. Investment in strong community and public services is fundamental to the well-being of us all. There have been some significant pay settlements and progress on pay equity, including the commitment to extend pay equity to all community social workers that was announced in November. But there has been pay restraint also, which has impacted the ability of public services to recruit and retain valuable workers. That remains a big problem. Budget 2023, what does it do for public and community services? Has there been a significant restraint on spending, and will there be an impact on the pay increases we have been seeking? These are core questions that we were looking to the budget to address. First up, it's great to see a range of pre-budget announcements which showed good investment in public services, such as education, this week's 400 million investment in 300 extra classrooms for 4 new schools. Cyclone Gabriel, $1 billion investment in repairing infrastructure in Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti, including 500 damaged schools and mental health support for children. Defence, big pay increases for the military in over a decade, and we're in the middle of bargaining a PSPA for our civilian members. Not just so we're expecting some good outcomes out of that. We also expect that offer from Defence to bridge the gap with the private sector pay rates, particularly for those people working, for example, in trades. In today's budget, it's welcome that this is not an austerity budget. There is significant investment in public and community services, in particular funding wage pressures. And it deals with some of our long-term challenges with a priority on infrastructure investment, with a new delivery agency and a national resilience plan. Budget invests $6 billion in rebuilding and strengthening roads, rail, bridges, electricity and telecoms networks hit by recent storm events, and strengthening them for the future. There are significant targeted cost of living measures which benefit so many of us in our whānau, and importantly, it's done so in a way that will not be inflationary. The government highlighted 4 cost of living announcements as the centrepieces of the budget. 20 hours free early childhood education expanded to include 2-year-olds, free prescriptions with the $5 prescription co-payment scrapped, free public transport for under 13-year-olds, half price for under 25-year-olds, reducing power bills, 100,000 more insulation and heating retrofits in the Warmer Kiwi Homes program. There's more support for the lowest income New Zealanders. The minimum wage increases to $22.70. Main benefits and student support increase in line with inflation and superannuation increases by $100 a pay for a couple. There's more support for families. The payment by the government of employer KiwiSaver contributions while on paid parental leave. There's extension of free school lunches through 2024. And significant investment in social services, including 3,000 more public houses, continuing this government's big building program. Whānau Ora will deliver some of these homes by June 2025. Community housing providers, including Māori and iwi partners will also be providing some of these homes. The additional funding for Māori housing, Māori education and cultural events like Te Matatingi and Matariku will be welcomed. In terms of public and community services and our members, there's 2.3 billion to implement the PSPA, that is the Public Service Pay Adjustment, for those agencies which are in scope. And that has delivered settlements for some agencies that have been going through bargaining, but there's many agencies that are still to complete their collective agreement bargaining. Care and support workers, the budget doesn't deliver everything we wanted. We were looking for funding for pay breaks for home support workers. We were also hoping for an increase to the mileage allowance for in-between travel. That is an increase to the kilometre rate for home support workers when they're travelling from home to home, and for funding to implement a shift model for these same workers. So that is disappointing not to see that. However, it is good to see the COVID leave scheme extended. This means low-paid care and support workers who deliver essential services have access to paid time off work if they have COVID. There is also good investment in funding for disability support services to recognise cost increases. The devil will be in the detail, but the investment into existing services is a good thing. There's the start of funding for extending pay equity to community social workers. MSD has $95 million over 3 years to keep on 490 frontline case managers, customer services representatives, and central processing staff. Without this, 490 people would have lost their jobs by June. There's recognition of pay disparity between directly employed health workers and health community workers. There is considerable disparity here. We will be seeking clarity over this in terms of this needing to apply to all community health workers. There is continued funding for work on the social insurance scheme. The scheme is on hold, but we welcome that the work will continue. Social insurance provides a level of income protection for those who lose their job through redundancy or health or disability. PSA has been a strong supporter of this initiative, which many countries have already adopted around the world. Removal of minimum wage exemption for disabled workers this is a scheme that allowed disabled people to be employed below the minimum wage for rates that could be as low as under 50 cents an hour I've seen, which is just horrendous. So we're very pleased about this win, which the PSA Deaf and Disabled Members Network, along with other advocates across the disability sector, have fought for a long time. We are not supportive of this being paid as a subsidy to employers. Paul Brown, a founding member of the PSA Deaf and Disabled Members Network, said to me in an email yesterday, and I'll quote, "Advocacy is a long game sometimes, and sometimes we don't win. But when we don't fight, we never win." So I think that's always good to remember, that we never give up. Persistence does pay off, and we'll keep having a fight about the things that need to still be improved on. In addition, there is an extra $863 million invested in disability support services. More good news after the government established a standalone ministry last year. It's good to see the investment of $5.3 million over 2 years to help strengthen the capability, resilience and diversity of the social service sector by funding community provider and sector groups, especially those who work with Māori, Pacific and ethnic communities. Also great to see is the Community Connectors program continuing, which helped so many through COVID. New science hubs are to be created. 3 new funded bodies bringing together expertise on some key challenges: climate change, health and pandemic readiness, and technology and innovation. This is positive, though we are not entirely sure it's a step change. It does, however, signal a desire to shift towards a more collaborative approach across science agencies. One budget never addresses all the issues we face as a country. And we will keep up our advocacy to keep making improvements in these critical areas. For the PSA, as the country's biggest union representing 87,000 community and public service workers, I believe this budget continues to move Aotearoa New Zealand in the right direction. We want more, not less, of this approach. Overall, Budget 2023 recognises the importance of maintaining strong community and public services and valuing the people who deliver them. This commitment stands in stark contrast to some of the political debate we have been seeing in recent months, which has frankly been insulting to the valuable contribution our members are making up and down the country to support people to thrive and businesses to prosper. The work of PSA members delivering vital community and public services has been a political football for the last 40 years. We can't afford any more of the stop-start spending and playing catch-up. We are already hearing voices advocating to undo the decisions made in this budget and plans for further cuts. Strong community and public services are the bedrock of wellbeing and success. No one person, community or industry can survive, let alone succeed, without this bedrock support. We have learned this so many times over the years, both in good times and most recently in the bad times facing crisis situations. If we are going to keep working hard to face our challenges of today and tomorrow, this commitment to strong public and community services and fairly paid workers must continue. And your union will continue to advocate for that.
Well, thank you so much. That was a really rich picture about what the budget means for public services and the people who work in it. And we have a lot of engagement in the chat as well as in the question and answer function. So thank you all for that. I would like to, reading the questions, I would like to start with one question about that multiple people asked in different ways about striking the right balance to not further increase inflation. Does the budget do that? People are very worried about mortgage rates and generally interest rates to go up, obviously, in that regard. Can you tell us a bit more about that, Craig?
Sure. So it's a good question, and it's a question that's asked a lot. The first thing that you should take some comfort of is that all of the spending that has been announced inside this budget is inside the analysis of where inflation is going to be over the next few years. So even with the spending that the government is delivering, we can see that inflation falls very rapidly over the next few quarters. By the end of this year, inflation, according to the Treasury, will be 4.5%. It's currently 6.7%, and it will fall further, but get down to the target rate by September 2024. So all of the spending of this government is already baked into that forecast. So it's not on top. Now, in terms of mortgage rates, that's a bit more of a lottery, because our friends at number 2, the Terrace, at the Reserve Bank, we're making those decisions based upon the economic factors that are in front of them. They have independence in that space. But I think what is fair is that we're not far from the peak in terms of where interest rates are likely to be, and where they're likely to sit for at least for a while. So there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel in that space. Things have been hard, undoubtedly, for a couple of years. People have really suffered because prices have gone up, interest rates have gone up, and they've often gone up to try and tackle a problem which they're not actually designed to solve. The problem came from oil prices. The problem came from shipping prices. The problem came from global commodity prices, and interest rates are very bad at tackling that problem. But where we are right now, we're probably at the top of that increasing cycle. And from this point forward, we might see one more OCR increase, but not lots more OCR, official cash rate increases. And we will start to see inflation probably continue its downward trajectory, regardless of what the government does in this particular spending. And then overall, as I said in my presentation, the Treasury believes that the government is actually taking demand out of the economy over the next few years because spending remains broadly the same. And so that helps to reduce inflationary pressures over the long run.
And I guess that speaks to our members who have shared in the chat and also in the question and answer function that they are not feeling it in their pocket yet.
And many New Zealanders aren't, you know, it's sort of, even whilst we have record wage increases, and currently wage increases are slightly above inflation, but that's an average figure. And of course, everyone's individual circumstances will be different. Last year, a third of Kiwis didn't get a pay rise at all. 73% of Kiwis got a pay rise less than 5%, which would still be less than inflation. So some people are clearly doing very well. The challenge for government and the challenge for the economy going forward is about making sure that as we recover in a way that doesn't exacerbate the inequalities that we saw before COVID, before the cyclone, and actually helps to mitigate those. And a big part of that will be making sure that we're putting money in the pockets of those who actually need it the most. And arguably some of the spending from the government, like the welfare programs that Kerry was talking about, like the prescription fees, like free public transport for the under 13s, are exactly about doing that, about putting money in the pockets of those who need it the most. And if I can just throw the opposite of that on the other side, what we probably don't need right now is an enormous tax cut for those who actually already have the highest incomes, because that would do exactly the opposite. It would exacerbate the very problems that people feel, and it would do very little to alleviate the problems in terms of people on low and middle incomes face. For those on the minimum wage, one of the tax cut proposals would put $2 a week in their pockets. That's great, but it's not going to solve any problems. And so what we need to see is more continued investment of the types that we've seen in this budget that actually put money in people's pockets, help reduce the everyday cost of living, and do so in a way that is equitable. And that's the key challenge.
So do you believe with regards to the different measures and investments that we have seen in terms of elevating the cost of living pressures, do some of those measures need to be more targeted, or are universal measures the best way of doing that?
It's often,
is it the right balance, I guess, in this budget is the question. It's
a really difficult call. It's often really hard to get a really good answer for that. So, for example, with prescription fees, we could means test prescription fees, but it's a $5 fee. It would cost more to means test than it would actually bring in, and so it's actually easier, cheaper, and more desirable, arguably, to just make it free. And then everybody has a standard, everyone has certainty of the benefit, and you actually don't end up paying an enormous administration fee to save very, very, very little money. Similarly, with public transport fees, under 13s go free. You could try and means test that benefit, but again, the means testing would cost more than you would save on the other side. So it's about actually making that. And so we also derive other benefits from those things. If people are taking medications regularly and early because they can, that means they end up less often in hospital. If people are on public transport, it means they're on cars.
But that's that point that you make about the double duty.
Yeah.
Changing people's behaviours, like having a two-pronged outcome, basically. So getting people, no matter how wealthy they are, into public transport has an impact on
benefit for everyone. Yeah,
it's a benefit for everybody.
And Bill English used to talk about social investment, and the idea that you could make targeted investments, you could make investments that would reduce the costs for everyone.
Yeah.
This is social investment. This is exactly these kinds of programs are the sorts of things that you would do if you were trying to create that dividend both for the public and for individuals.
Thank you. We have a few questions around tax as well. I guess we can't avoid that subject. So tell us a little bit about what happened with regards to tax in this budget. Were there any changes? And also, why do you think some of our members have the impression that the government is very hesitant in terms of increasing their debt? And these are all ways of investing, obviously, in public and community services. Taking more money out of the bank or increasing taxes, which would be, I guess, important if we want to continue down that path. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Kerry? No, I think first things first. It's important that I state quite clearly that I don't work for the government. I work for the CTU, and so I can't really tell you what insights the government had at that particular point. I can speculate.
Certainly, if we were doing that,
it would be very different indeed, and arguably much better. But we'll classify that. But in terms of tax, there were three big tax changes at the budget, and they were the biggest one of which, by far, was the removal of for trusts to be able to be taxed at the standard rate, which was the 33% rate, and now gets moved to the 39% rate. The reason for that is because we've discovered lots of evidence that very high income earners are using trusts to avoid paying the right level of income tax. And so that loophole being closed puts people in the right tax bracket. It means that they can't use trusts as a mechanism to avoid paying tax. So that was a really important tax measure in that space, and it generates quite a significant amount of income, just a little over $1 billion in a year. There was a digital tax. It's important to say it's not a digital services tax. It's not a Google tax, but it's a tax on digital transactions where goods and services are being sold, but currently they're outside of the tax regime, and that just brings them back inside the normal tax regime like anybody else. So again, it's just closing a loophole in that space. And then thirdly, there's an international program, which for those of you who are desperately following along at home is called the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Program from the OECD, or the BEPS program. And it makes it has made a number of recommendations for advanced democracies around the world about how to make their tax systems more standardized and stable, and how to avoid multinational tax avoidance. And we've incorporated a bunch of those changes. And so a part of that means that multinationals will be paying more tax in New Zealand as a consequence of those changes. So there's three big changes there. On the other side, you are right, there was not significant taxation change, and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance and everybody else was at huge pains at the beginning to state that they weren't expecting there to be. I think that's the sort of conversation that you have as a political party rather than as a government this close to an election. You can announce it, but even if you announce the big tax change, it takes 12 weeks. That's the minimum that you require for a big tax change in order to talk to the payroll providers and everybody else. By the time you get it through the House, make those changes, you're on the election already. So it effectively becomes a political campaign. So I think the right place to have that is on the campaign. I don't have any particular insight as to what the government is thinking or the political parties are thinking in that space. But what I think is quite clear from the mood music is that tax will play a really important part of the election campaign, and we're likely to see increasingly divergent views as to the role of tax and economic development. One side of the fence saying we can cut taxes, we can give you some money back, and we can somehow magic public services to be at the same rate and quality at the same on that way. On the other side of the fence is saying we need a level of tax which is associated with the kind of decent society that we want to see, where we properly fund health and education and public services in a way that we know New Zealanders want to have. And so that will increasingly be the choice of the election. There are plenty of different ways of getting there, be it a tax-free zone, be it personal allowances, be it a range of different things. And we'll just have to wait and see what happens then. But why do governments not do that? Make tax decisions? Because if you get it wrong, it's existential, it's life or death. So you've got to be absolutely careful and absolutely certain about that. And that's where I think they're going right now. They're probably working their way through their own political party tax policies rather than announcing them at the budget.
Thank you so much. We are getting to the end of our webinar. It feels like we could continue our conversation for hours and hours. But I would like to just check before we are closing. Are there any final comments that you would like to make?
Just from me, if you want to learn more, if you want to see essentially the big details of the slides, can I point that report, the one that you've printed? Yeah. There is a copy as a report on our website on the CTU's front page, which goes through in depth and the budget goes through line by line in terms of the big spending areas. It has lots of all of the charts and things that we talked about here, where you can see what was actually happening in the various areas and has our commentary on those areas. So if you want more details, it's all in there in that report, and that's all downloadable from the CTU website.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Just a final comment from me is that obviously if we in the PSA were writing the budget, we'd be wanting more of the same or more investment in community and public services, not less. And we know that we never get all we want out of a budget, any one budget. But what we do know is that budgets reflect values. And from my perspective anyway, the values that underpin this budget of wellbeing and investment in community and public services, values that the PSA would support in line with our strategic goals about building strong community and public services.
Thank you so much. What an important point that, the budget is actually reflecting values, and it is reflecting where we are traveling in the future. And as both of you have highlighted, it is a budget that supports New Zealanders, or is starting to support New Zealanders with the cost of living and the services that people rely on, but really to support well-being for everyone who lives in New Zealand. We need to really commit to strong public and community services and fairly paid workers, because otherwise it won't be sustainable going forward. So as Craig said before, the report from the CTU will be available on their website. This webinar will be available on our website, on the PSA website, including the slides that you wanted to present. Apologies again for that. And I would just like to close us off with a whakatauki and thank you all for coming along. Please share the information or what you learned today with your colleagues and your whānau. And also a big thank you for everyone who supported the webinar and the analysis that went into the various reports and this webinar. So thank you everyone for coming along and for attending. Nau te roro, nāku te roro, ka ora ai te iwi. Thank you everyone and stay well.